Thank you, and thank you, Julie, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about a subject I'm very enthusiastic about. We don't have much time. I'll err on the side of talking too fast rather than too slow. The slides reflect what I'm going to say, so you can either listen or look, but I'd suggest you listen. You know the subject of this talk, which is about lunatic asylums. The report on lunatic asylums by Frederick Norton Manning, published in 1868. This is Frederick Norton Manning. This is Queen Victoria. Norton Manning's life coincided with very closely with the reign of Victoria, and he was in very many senses a Victorian psychiatrist. Needs to be judged, I think, on that basis, if he's to be judged at all. Okay, he of course is born in the UK, his father being a farmer. His siblings didn't migrate. Norton Manning got his MB in 1860 at St George's Hospital in London, and then 2 years later his MD at the University of St Andrews in Scotland, and then joined the Royal Navy and saw service in the Maori Wars. And following that service, he was on board the brig Esk, which arrived in Sydney in 1867. Now I'd like you to time travel to Sydney in the 1860s, and you'll be in a bustling, chaotic, small city, no bigger than Albury, Wodonga, but going through a period of rapid transformation, as it would quadruple its population in the next 20 years, the 20 years between 1860 and 1880. Convict transportation had ceased in 1840. The pastoral industry was thriving and the gold rush was well underway. So think of it, imagine the plight of an insane person migrated to, as I would have been, to a place where there was no family and little in the way of support. Manning had a letter introducing him to James MacArthur, a prominent pastoralist and politician, describing Manning as highly distinguished in his medical capacities and being a man of the world, very well informed and a terrific companion. He was introduced a little later to Henry Parkes, the colonial secretary, who immediately recognised somebody with great talent and offered him the position of medical superintendent of Tarban Creek Asylum, which was the principal asylum for the colony of New South Wales. Parkes was to become a friend of Manning, and together they transformed what was available to the insane during the next 20, 30 years. Manning accepted the offer on condition that he should be allowed and empowered and paid to travel to the Northern Hemisphere to acquaint himself with all the modes of treatment available for the insane and to collect information about asylums. And in these travels he indeed went to England, Ireland, Scotland, America, France, Germany, Belgium and Holland. It was supposed to only take 6 months, but it took him 11. But the report is a consequence of those travels. He visited 66 asylums. He spoke to many important psychiatrists, including the Commissioners for Lunacy for Britain. He and Thomas Kirkbride, a famous psychiatrist in Pennsylvania. He obtained copies of plans for 30 asylums, and his report of 167 pages was published by the New South Wales government printer. There's a story behind that, but I will leave that to question time if you want it. Now the report is divided into 4 parts. Well, I counted, it's actually 3 parts. In the introduction he lists the institutions that he visited. Then in part A he described what he found, and his findings included the construction and organisation of all the visited asylums and institutions, and his comments about their merits or demerits. He reported the advocacy which he encountered for early treatment. Now, you would maybe, I hope, mindful of the fact that this was the absolute heyday of asylum psychiatry. Asylums had been built across England from about the 1830s onwards, and a similar phenomenon was seen in the United States and in the continent, on the continent. The psychiatrists he encountered were all very enthusiastic about what they were doing and their results, and they're all advocates for early treatment. Okay, Part A also describes in some detail restraint and seclusion, what to do with patients who are disturbed. And this is still a preoccupation of psychiatrists in 2017, in spite of the fact we all have all sorts of drugs to try to control these situations. Part B was in fact his suggestions, his recommendations for the state of New South Wales. So if you have a look at that book, you'll find plans for asylums at the back of it. You'll also find the description of sanitary arrangements and water closets, every sort of detail of enormous importance for lunatic asylums. The term, I'm using the term which was then current, which was being changed to a mental asylum. Norton Manning was in fact called the Tarban Creek Asylum, the hospital for the insane at Gladesville, when he took it over on his return from this tour. So the report reflected the enthusiastic advocacy of early treatment. You're mindful, I'm sure, of the fact that there were no specific medications or other treatments for psychiatric disorder in those days, and there weren't to be for nearly 100 years. And the management and the treatment theory was to do with the environment in which the patient would be placed. Manning quoted from Forbes Winslow's book. Forbes Winslow was the president of the Medico-Psychological Association, which sprouted enthusiastically that there would be an easy and speedy cure in 70 to 80% of cases, which is a bit optimistic. But in fact, I think you might see the results, looking at the statistics, if they are accurate, as being quite favourable, in the sense 40 to 50% of patients were discharged within a year, and the readmission rate was much reduced from what it is now. I won't go into seclusion and restraint at any length, although the book deals with that. Seclusion, of course, is the process of putting a patient, taking the patient away from the body of patients and putting that person in a place where they can do least damage to themselves or others. Restraint refers to the question of whether you can use muffs, camisoles, straitjackets. Now in the 1860s, as I read the book, most authorities he approached said restraint was unacceptable, but usually there's a rider at the end unless it's absolutely necessary, and it should only happen, and this is reported in the report, if a medical officer prescribes it, and it has to be noted in a journal. There's some discussion of the use of opium, which is the closest thing they had to a psychoactive agent, but as you know, it is very dangerous. It's causing respiratory depression not long after it sedates the patient, and it doesn't remove, of course, depression or mania, which are the main problems. So, in Pennsylvania, he spoke with Thomas Kirkbride. You may be aware that the main block at Callan Park is called the Kirkbride block, reflecting Kirkbride's reputation. According to Kirkbride, all restraint was evil. That's a quote. If it could be done without, so was laudanum. Seclusion. The attendant should have the power to impose seclusion, but only under the most pressing circumstances and not for the punishment of patients, and not as a remedy. It has to be approved by a medical officer, and again, it should be noted in a journal. And these notes were actually made, and Norton Manning was pretty scrupulous in his inspection of the mental hospitals that he subsequently visited on a regular basis. An excellent plan is to put irritable patients in the open air, in an airing court, or if not, in seclusion rooms that should be light and cheerful, or a vacant gallery. Now the options for management, again, we're only talking about a sort of environmental management. So, and we're talking about the pauper insane. Now, there was no financial assistance if you're at home in Britain, but if you're in Scotland, there was a facility for getting some payment to families to look after their mentally unwell. Manning described, he said he thought this was not a plan that would work in New South Wales because of the transient and peripatetic nature of the population and lack of families. Colonies for the insane were examined at that time. There's some debate about them. The only one that there's a report in that report is at Giel in Belgium, and these were colonies of I think 1,000 or several thousand insane persons managed in a community. Manning wasn't very keen on this because he thought there was a lot of abuse of patients. Then there were farm asylums, which are semi-open asylums, in which there'd be a lot of rural work and stuff like that, and close asylums, which was the model for the day and which was employed in all the countries that he visited in a big way and allowed greater control of management. Manning pumped for the fourth option and said that the surroundings should closely as possible resemble those of ordinary life. The report is, there are many pages on all the issues related to asylum construction and management, having water, drainage, sewage, terribly important, instructions for attendants, not usually called nurses in those days, clothing, animals. Tarban Creek, they had animals of all types. I think they had llamas too. They had everything available in Australia, plus from South America. Curtains, every aspect of the environment was looked at. He also reported in this report on asylums for the criminally insane. The Parramatta Asylum was serving that function at that time in New South Wales. Asylums for what was then called idiocy, and we now call developmental disability, and there are triage houses such as the reception house in Darlinghurst existing in other cities, and he looked at them. From these triage houses, patients were moved after a proper assessment to the various asylums. His recommendations, and I'm not sure how he made all of these recommendations because he didn't really know a lot about what was happening in New South Wales, but the recommendations seem pretty reasonable. Parramatta Asylum should be abandoned, not a bad idea, but it wasn't physically possible to do that. That's the one largely for the chronic and criminally insane. That 3 smaller asylums be built. Goulburn, that happened. Orange eventually happened. Maitland didn't happen. Tarban Creek Asylum be upgraded, and the new asylum be built in Sydney, which was proved to be Callan Park. Now this report was good enough to provide guidance for the various mental services of the colonies of Australia for the next 30 years. And I think a reader from the continent or from Britain would find interesting comments about the state of medical psychology in 1867. So he moved, he took up his job. It was a pretty awful situation at Tarban Creek Asylum. He renamed it the Hospital for the Insane at Gladesville and made steady improvements in all aspects of life. 10 years later, he claimed in his retirement speech that it had been changed from every prison-like association had been removed, and there was a large measure of public trust in the institution. After 10 years there, he was appointed to become the Inspector General of the Insane, essentially the he was in charge of all the psychiatric services in New South Wales. He retired from that position 20 years later. In his time, during his tenure, new hospitals were built at Newcastle. Reception house at Darlinghurst was upgraded. Kenmore was commenced at Goulburn. Rydalmere Hospital was taken over. I think it was an orphanage or something like that. And Callan Park was built. Callan Park was is a veritable palace, which I hope you will all visit. It really is something. And imagine entering, I mean, no one wants to be insane and no one wants to have to go anywhere, especially under duress, but Callan Park must have been really something in its day. Of course, the population, the beds and the patient numbers went from 600, 550, 600 up to I think nearly 2,000 at one point. So there was a terrific degeneration over the decades. Manning was largely responsible for a Lunacy Act in 1878, which was good enough to last for 70 years. It was only revised properly in the 1850s and 1950s, in my time. He tried to break down indifference and prejudices by public education. He wrote in journals like the Melbourne Examiner on the causes of mental disorder. He was one of the principal trustees and founders of Royal Prince Alfred Hospital. If you go into it on the right-hand side in the portico as you go in, you'll see the bust of Norton Manning. He was secretary of the medical board for a time, and he's acknowledged in everything that's written about RPA. University, he was became an examiner in psychological medicine, the first lecturer. He was very keen on proper training of medical graduates in certification. This bas relief you'll find in the Maclaurin Hall for Norton Manning, the only person on the walls who is not a full professor. He wrote over a dozen papers, including ones on Aboriginal insanity. He is very prominent in the proceedings of the first and second International Colonial Medical Congresses. And when he spoke on insanity and the law, cretinism and Aboriginal mental illness, he gave advice to all the colonies when asked by the various governments. He was appointed to the Board of Health in New South Wales, not psychiatry, but General Board of Health, and was medical advisor to the government, not just psychiatry. The President of the Board of Health and Health and Immigration Officer for Port Jackson. He was a member of the Royal Society. He was trustee of the National Art Gallery. He did an enormous amount for nurse training, both psychiatric and non-psychiatric, and helped create the Australasian Trained Nurses Association and was its first president. We don't know much about his personal life. He never married. He lived in Hunters Hill. He had rooms in Phillip Street towards the end. He wasn't very well in the last decade of his life. He's buried at Gladesville Hospital. In the Dictionary of Biography, the Australian Dictionary, it says D.I. MacDonald, his biography historian, said a tribute to his administration was that the hospitals for the insane had not attracted unfavourable publicity during his 30 years. That's his grave at Gladesville, driving along Victoria Road to the west. If you just go in the entrance and turn a little bit left, you can find his grave next to that of Eric Sinclair, his successor. I'm indebted to Graham Edwards, my senior colleagues, Graham Edwards and Peter Shea, for a lot of the work they did on Norton Manning. And I'm very happy to answer questions if time allows. Adam.
What does the word close mean in close hospitals or close asylum?
Yes, I assume, I haven't quite sorted that out myself. I think it means small rather than farm and large, because you'd think it would be closed asylum rather than, yeah, so, and it's closed, not closed. I think that's your point perhaps. There may be another explanation, but not one that I know.
Can you tell us the publishing story?
Oh, the publishing story is this. Initially, it was suggested by Parkes that he should publish at his own expense. He replied that if that would mean that he had copyright and perhaps he was ambitious. He thought it would have value, and he said it would be better if the government did it, and then they had copyright. But he may well, for all we know, I mean, he might have been canny and thought it's more likely to be respected if it goes to a legislative assembly and is looked at properly.
It's interesting when you kind of look at what he did, and thank you for that, that was just great. But I think the other thing was, like, when he was looking at where to place Callan Park, he always had the interests of the patients at heart, didn't he? Kind of like he wanted entertainments, he wanted pleasant views, he sort of, I think it's something that gets lost in all the statistics, but my reading of what he's done and what psychiatry was like at that time was very patient-centred and very much about how to treat the patients very well. And
You've probably also, apart from reading parts of his report, his speech on retirement is often quoted. It really flows from the heart, and it is about the sanctity of the respect for the needs of the patients and what incredible work attendants and nurses were doing, and there's no greater vocation than to be doing this. Yes, indeed. I should perhaps, he had a lot to do with the building itself, the design and other features. I think Gladesville was in fact a pretty nice spot, but it was a pretty rotten hospital at that time. I think the site of Callan Park had been chosen around the time he was appointed. You may know more about that than I, but I'm not sure that he actually chose the spot. But indeed, it's a tremendous spot.
Thanks very much, Richard. Terminology was very fluid in those days. You talked about insane and so on. At the beginning, I think you referred to him as a psychiatrist. Did he refer to himself as a psychiatrist? Because, I mean, I know, and I was interested that you said he went to Germany, because I know that in Germany there was no, until the latter part of the century, of people like Kreppel and so on, and Freud in Vienna, they weren't call themselves psychiatrists. And there was a dispute between neurologists and psychiatrists, and neurologists, as often as not, had control of psychiatric hospitals. So what did he actually call himself?
I think that he would probably have called himself as an asylum medical superintendent. But you're quite, of course you're right. The terms changed over the decades from the middle of the 19th century, where medical psychology was the term, and then it became psychiatry and accepted as a term at the end of the century. And he, maybe in his later years, he might have accepted that term. And and there are a lot of, I'm just missing another term that I was wanting to, alienist is the other one. And alienist was a term that was used in the middle of the 19th century. Then I thought it had gone, but then when Eric Sinclair died in 1925, the headline the byline in the Sydney Morning Herald was "Famous Alienist Dies." So I think the terms carry over. Alienists, you might be interested, perhaps, that alienists as a term. I always wondered, does this mean because the patients are alien in some way? But I understand it's from the French and from that insanity, to be insane was to be alien, A-L-I-E-N. So, but that's something, I mean, all of these terms are very interesting in how they change or don't change over the decades. Hospital for the insane was thought to be a terrific idea. Changing it from a lunatic asylum, mental asylum, hospital really seemed to make a big difference in public perception.
Do you think there was a catalyst for him to be driven to dedicate his life to looking after mentally ill people? Like, do you think there was a moment, or do you think it was a need that he just saw and he drove himself into it?
I don't know, and I haven't been, quite a lot's been written about him, but I haven't read descriptions of him as a young man and his early influences before he did medicine. In the Maori Wars, he was heroic in rescuing fellow officers in the Battle of the Gates of Pa. He was. I don't know what that means. I don't know. I'm sure there are episodes in his life that I just don't know. I don't know from his family of origin, and I don't think he spoke about it himself. Or if he did, it wasn't recorded. I'm sorry, I can't answer that really. It would be extremely interesting. A lot of the psychiatrists in that era were pretty devoted people who were very idealistic. And, you know, of course, the reforms to law in England in the 1830s, 1840s to do with insanity, sort of exemplary sort of ideas about social change and improving things. So if people had good motives, I think there was, and before we became cynical about the failures, it was thought, wow, that's great. It must have been an opportunity for people who are idealistic and really good to get going.
Making a comparison between the circumstances then and now, where you have so many more sources of information and access, but in his day he seemed strikingly effective. I mean, to look at the sort of more democratic process or environment today, is there any modelling that can be extracted from that unusual situation of a gifted man in a early colonial situation? How do you attribute an effective comparison between the governor, that man, and today in the efficiency of the system overall in a democratic society?
Oh, dear idea. I don't know. I wish I could do justice to that. All I can say is, if you read about, two things. One, if you read about the asylum psychiatrists in the 1840s and 1850s and the movement towards reform, there was a buzz in the air about it all. Maybe these buzzes come and go, and cynicism breaks in. And indeed, by 1900, the asylums were full, and patients weren't getting better, and you know, and so everyone was black in their attitude towards what was happening. The other thing is maybe I don't know enough about it, but I think Sydney if there was gold around and people were bustling around and there seemed to be opportunities, and someone like Henry Parkes could do well from a very poor background and be doing great things. Maybe that was part of that time too. Does that answer partly what you're saying? But that's just supposition on my part. I'm very impressed that you all came. Thanks very much for that, really.
Thank you. If anyone wanted to go up and take